Emergency services, what's your location? Madre de Dios River, my friend. Oh God, there's so much blood. A jaguar, it dragged him into the jungle. Please, you have to help us. Sir, I need you to stay calm. Can you see your friend now? No. It took him. The jaguar took Luis into the trees. We can hear him screaming, please hurry. In the remote rainforests of southeastern Peru, where the Madre de Dios River cuts through millions of acres of untamed wilderness, what began as a peaceful ecotourism canoe trip would become a nightmare that would grip an entire nation. The morning mist hung heavy over the chocolate-colored waters, and the air was thick with humidity and the calls of howler monkeys echoing through the canopy. Luis Vargas was 34 years old, a passionate nature photographer from Lima with an infectious smile and an unshakable belief that the Amazon's most dangerous predators were simply misunderstood. He had no idea that his lifelong dream of capturing the perfect jaguar photograph would become a fight for survival that would test every limit of human endurance. This is Luis Vargas's story. A story of passion, ambition, and the moment when man's confidence collided with nature's raw, unstoppable power. A story of survival that would change everything he thought he knew about the jungle he loved so deeply. You're watching Wild Encounters, where we bring you the most shocking real-life animal survival stories. If the story grips you, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon, because what you're about to witness will change how you see the Amazon rainforest forever. Luis Vargas went into that jungle as a photographer. What happened next would transform him into something else entirely, a survivor whose story defies belief. The Amazon doesn't forgive mistakes. And on March 15, 2023, along the winding waters of the Madre de Dios, Luis Vargas was about to learn that lesson in the most terrifying way possible. This is the story of his final canoe trip, and the Tinho. Luis Vargas wasn't just another tourist with a camera. He was Peru's most celebrated wildlife photographer, a man whose stunning images of Amazon wildlife had graced the covers of National Geographic and sparked conservation efforts across South America. His photographs didn't just capture animals, they captured souls, revealing the intelligence and dignity of creatures most people feared. Born in 1989 in Lima's bustling San Isidro district, Luis grew up in a world of concrete and car horns, far from the wilderness that would define his life. His father, Carlos Vargas, was a successful accountant who hoped his son would follow a traditional path. His mother, Maria Elena, was a primary school teacher who filled their home with books about nature and adventure. It was Maria Elena who first sparked Luis's fascination with the natural world, reading him stories about explorers and showing him documentaries about exotic animals. Luis's passion for photography began at age 12 when his uncle Ricardo gave him an old film camera for his birthday. "This belonged to your grandfather," Ricardo had said. "He used it to document his construction projects, but maybe you'll find something more interesting to shoot." Luis spent that entire summer photographing everything he could find. Street dogs, pigeons, even insects in their small garden. But it wasn't until a family trip to Iquitos when he was 15 that Luis discovered his true calling. On that trip, Luis encountered his first wild monkey, a curious squirrel monkey that approached their boat along the Amazon tributaries. The connection was instant and profound. Through his camera lens, Luis saw intelligence, personality, and a wildness that spoke to something deep in his soul. That single photograph of the monkey, with its bright eyes and expressive face, would hang in his bedroom for years, a constant reminder of where he belonged. His parents initially worried about their son's obsession with dangerous places and wild animals. "You have such talent, Mijo," his mother would say. "But why can't you photograph weddings or portraits like normal photographers?" Would just smile and show her his latest images, a spectacular sunset over the Tambopata Reserve, or a family of Capuchin monkeys playing in the canopy. Eventually, even his practical father had to admit that Luis had found something special. Friends describe Luis as fearless but never reckless, Passionate but never foolish. Miguel Santos, his closest friend since university, recalls their first expedition together to Canoe National Park in 2015. Luis had this incredible ability to read the jungle, Miguel says. He could sense when animals were near, could track them for hours without disturbing their natural behavior. But what impressed me most was his respect. He never pushed too hard, never took unnecessary risks. Just for a photograph. That respect for wildlife had earned Luis an international reputation. His 2019 photo series on endangered Andean bears had helped secure protected status for crucial habitat areas. His intimate portraits of Amazon River dolphins had raised awareness about pollution threatening their survival. Conservation organizations across Peru sought his collaboration, knowing that Luis's images could move people to action in ways that statistics and reports never could. But it was Luis's dream of photographing jaguars that would ultimately lead him to that fateful trip on the Madre de Dios River. Jaguars were the one species that had eluded him throughout his career. He had captured images of their tracks, their territories, even their prey, but never the cats themselves. The jaguar is the ghost of the forest, Luis often told people. It sees you long before you see it. Getting that perfect shot requires patience, skill, and maybe a little bit of luck. Luis had spent 3 years planning for this expedition, studying jaguar behavior patterns, identifying the best locations along the river where the big cats came to drink and hunt. He had consulted with local indigenous guides, marine biologists, and even other photographers who had attempted similar projects. Everyone warned him about the dangers, but Luis was confident in his preparation and experience. His girlfriend, Isabella Martinez, a veterinarian from Cusco, had begged him not to go alone. "Take Miguel with you," she had pleaded during their last dinner together in Lima. Or at least hire more experienced guides. These cats aren't like the monkeys you usually photograph, Luis. They're apex predators. Luis had kissed her forehead and promised to be careful. "I've been preparing for this my whole career," I said. "This is my chance to capture something truly extraordinary." Those who knew Luis best would later say they saw the signs of his growing obsession in the months leading up to the trip. He had become increasingly isolated, spending hours studying jaguar footage and behavioral research. The normally cautious approach to wildlife photography had begun to shift toward something more aggressive, more determined. He was convinced this trip would define his legacy, Miguel recalls. But looking back, I wonder if his desire for that perfect shot had begun to cloud his judgment. Luis believed that understanding came through proximity, that the best wildlife photography required getting close enough to see the soul behind the eyes. It was a philosophy that had served him well with dozens of species across the Amazon. But jaguars, as Luis was about to discover, played by entirely different rules. Jaguars are the apex predators of the Amazon, the third largest big cat species in the world and the most powerful predator in the Americas. Unlike their African and Asian cousins, jaguars are solitary hunters with the strongest bite force of any big cat, capable of crushing turtle shells and caiman skulls with ease. In the wild, these magnificent creatures are masters of stealth, moving through dense jungle like shadows, their spotted coats providing perfect camouflage among the dappled sunlight of the forest floor. Adult male jaguars typically weigh between 200 to 300 pounds, with some exceptional specimens reaching over 350 pounds. Their territory can span up to 100 square kilometers, and they are equally comfortable hunting on land or in water. Unlike most cats, jaguars are excellent swimmers and often hunt caimans, fish, and capybaras along riverbanks. Their hunting strategy relies on ambush tactics. They prefer to strike once, decisively, rather than engage in prolonged chases. The jaguar that would forever change Luis Vargas's life was a massive male, estimated by local guides to weigh nearly 280 pounds. The indigenous Shipibo people who lived along the Madre de Dios had been tracking this particular cat for over 2 years, calling him Otorongo Aten, the Great Jaguar. His territory stretched along a 15-kilometer section of riverbank known for its dense vegetation and abundant prey. Otorongo-Aton first appeared in the area during the dry season of 2021, likely displaced from his original territory by deforestation activities upstream. Local guide Cesar Tenanta, a Shipibo elder with 40 years of jungle experience, first encountered the jaguar's tracks near a clay lick frequented by tapirs and peccaries. These were the largest jaguar prints I had ever seen, Cesar recalls. The pad was wider than my palm, and the stride length told me this was an old, experienced male. A cat like this doesn't fear anything. 4 months, Otorongo-Aton remained largely invisible, known only through his tracks, territorial markings, and the occasional kill discovered by fishermen. But gradually, his behavior began to change. River guides started reporting unusual sightings, the jaguar drinking at the water's edge during daylight hours, something typically nocturnal cats rarely do. More concerning were reports of the jaguar showing curiosity rather than fear when encountering human presence. Luis first learned about Otorongo-Aton from Cesar during a preliminary scouting trip in January 2023. The guide had been reluctant to discuss the jaguar, explaining that his people considered such encounters to be matters of spiritual significance. This cat is different, Cesar warned Luis during their meeting at the small river town of Boca, Colorado. It has lost his natural caution. My grandfather would say his spirit has been disturbed. But Luis was captivated by the stories. Here was a jaguar that might actually allow him to get close enough for the photographs he had dreamed of capturing. Against Cesar's advice, Luis began planning his expedition around the specific locations where Otorongo-Aton had been sighted. He studied satellite imagery of the jaguar's territory, identified the best camera positions, and even calculated optimal lighting conditions for different times of day. Dr. Patricia Rojas, a carnivore specialist with Peru's National Service of Natural Protected Areas, had been monitoring jaguar populations along the Madre de Dios for over a decade. When she learned of Luis's plans through conservation networks, she immediately reached out to warn him. Any jaguar showing reduced fear of humans is potentially dangerous, Dr. Rojas explained during a video call with Luis in February. This behavioral change could indicate illness, injury, or simply an individual that has become too comfortable with human presence. Either way, it represents a significant risk. Luis dismissed these concerns, interpreting the jaguar's boldness as an opportunity rather than a warning. He believed his years of experience with Amazon wildlife had prepared him for any encounter. I've photographed caimans from 3 meters away, he told Dr. Rojas. I've spent hours in trees with howler monkeys screaming directly at me. The jaguar might be curious about humans, but that just means he's intelligent enough to recognize we're not a threat. But Dr. Rojas knew something Luis didn't. Jaguars that lose their natural fear of humans often become problem animals. In Brazil's Pantanal region, similar cases had resulted in livestock predation and, in rare instances, attacks on people. Jaguars are not like other cats, she warned Luis. They don't bluff, charge, or give warning displays. When a jaguar decides to attack, it does so with overwhelming force and precision. The warning signs were there for anyone willing to see them. In the weeks leading up to Luis's expedition, local fishermen reported finding partially eaten fish left on riverbanks, unusual behavior that suggested the jaguar was well-fed and hunting for reasons other than hunger. River guide Antonio Flores discovered fresh jaguar tracks leading directly to his camp near the Tambopata confluence, with claw marks on trees just meters from where tourists typically slept. Most disturbing was an incident reported by wildlife researcher James Mitchell, an American biologist studying river otters in the area. In early March, Mitchell's research team encountered Otorongo-Aton during daylight hours near their base camp. The jaguar approached to within 30 meters of our group, Mitchell documented in his field notes. Rather than retreating when we made noise and appeared larger, the animal sat down and observed us for nearly 10 minutes. This is highly abnormal behavior for a wild jaguar. Local indigenous communities began restricting their river activities to certain hours, avoiding areas where the jaguar had been sighted. Shipibo elder Maria Tenanta, Caesar's sister, performed traditional ceremonies to appease what she believed was a disturbed forest spirit. When the balance is broken, she explained to Luis during his final visit to Boca, Colorado, both man and animal suffer. This jaguar carries darkness with him. But Luis remained convinced that his careful planning and photographic expertise would keep him safe. He had invested thousands of dollars in specialized equipment, including motion sensors and camera traps that would allow him to monitor the jaguar's movements without direct confrontation. His plan was methodical: establish a base camp upstream from the jaguar's core territory, use remote cameras to track movement patterns, and only attempt direct photography from the safety of his reinforced canoe. What Luis failed to understand was that Odorongo 18 had already been tracking him. Indigenous guides later revealed that jaguar tracks had been found around Luis's preliminary campsites, suggesting the cat had been monitoring human activity in his territory for weeks. The jaguar wasn't just unafraid of humans, he had become actively curious about them. On March 14th, the day before Luis's final canoe trip, Caesar made one last attempt to change the photographer's mind. "My dreams have been dark," the guide told Luis. "The forest spirits are restless. Perhaps it would be better to wait for another season when the balance returns." Luis thanked Caesar for his concern but politely declined his advice. He had come too far and prepared too extensively to turn back now. That evening, as Luis made his final preparations at the research station near the Tambopata Reserve, Odorongo 18 was less than 2 kilometers away, his powerful form moving silently through the undergrowth toward the very stretch of river where Luis planned to begin his photography expedition at dawn. In the 2 weeks leading up to March 15th, the situation along the Madre de Dios River had begun to deteriorate rapidly. Odorongo 18's behavior became increasingly erratic and bold, displaying patterns that even the most experienced jaguar researchers had never documented. The great cat was no longer content to simply observe human activity from a distance. He had begun actively following boats, leaving territorial markings near campsites, and exhibiting what could only be described as stalking behavior. Luis first noticed the changes during his final scouting trip on March 1st. Fresh jaguar tracks surrounded his temporary camp each morning, complete with scratch marks on nearby trees that seemed deliberately placed to be discovered. When he showed photographs of these markings to local guides, their reactions were uniformly concerned. "This cat is playing games," explained river guide Roberto Silva, who had been working the Madre de Dios for 25 years. "Jaguars don't normally mark territory so close to human camps unless they're claiming it." Dr. Patricia Rojas returned to the area on March 5th after receiving increasingly alarming reports from research stations throughout the region. Her assessment was immediate and dire. "This animal has crossed a behavioral threshold," she documented in her emergency report to CERNIMP, Peru's Protected Areas Authority. "Odorongo 18 is no longer exhibiting normal jaguar territorial behavior. He has become fixated on human presence, which represents an imminent danger to anyone entering his territory." But Luis interpreted these developments differently. In his field journal, recovered later by investigators, he wrote extensively about what he saw as a breakthrough opportunity. He believed the jaguar's curiosity indicated an unprecedented chance to document natural behavior at close range. Other photographers have spent decades trying to get within 100 meters of a wild jaguar, Luis wrote. "This individual seems willing to tolerate much closer proximity. If I can maintain proper respect and non-threatening behavior, this could result in the most intimate jaguar photography ever captured." His friends and family began expressing serious concerns about his obsession. Isabella Martinez made multiple attempts to convince Luis to postpone the expedition, even driving from Cusco to Lima to confront him in person on March 8. "You're not thinking clearly," she told him during what witnesses described as an emotional argument at his apartment. "This isn't about photography anymore. You're putting yourself in danger for your ego." Luis's response revealed how deeply his judgment had become compromised. "You don't understand," he told Isabella. "This is what I've been working toward my entire career. Other photographers will never have this opportunity. If I don't document this now, someone else might kill this Jaguar out of fear." Isabella left that meeting convinced that Luis had become so fixated on his goal that he was incapable of seeing the risks. Miguel Santos, Luis's closest friend, made his own intervention attempt on March 10th. During their phone conversation, Miguel offered to join the expedition as additional safety support. "If you're determined to do this, at least take me with you," Miguel pleaded. "Two people means better safety protocols, and I can help with equipment management." But Luis refused, claiming that multiple people would disturb the Jaguar's natural behavior and ruin the photographic opportunity. The psychological analysis later conducted by Dr. Elena Vasquez, a specialist in extreme behavior psychology, identified classic signs of what she termed achievement fixation syndrome. Luis had become so focused on capturing the perfect Jaguar photograph that he had lost the ability to rationally assess risk. When individuals become this invested in a specific outcome, Dr. Vasquez explained, they often reinterpret warning signs as obstacles to overcome rather than genuine dangers to avoid. Social media posts from Luis's accounts during this period reveal the progression of his dangerous mindset. On March 8th, he posted a photo of Odorongo 8's tracks with the caption, "Getting closer to something extraordinary. The forest is speaking to me." By March 12th, his posts had become more grandiose. "Some opportunities only come once in a lifetime. True artists must be willing to risk everything for perfection." The response from his online followers was mixed but increasingly concerned. Fellow photographers warned about the dangers of approaching jaguars, while conservation experts questioned the ethics of potentially habituating a wild predator to human presence. Dr. James Martinez, a wildlife photographer with 30 years of Amazon experience, commented directly on Luis's posts, "Brother, I've been where you are mentally. The shot isn't worth your life. The cats are not your friends." Luis responded defensively to criticism, arguing that his years of experience and careful preparation made him uniquely qualified for this type of encounter. He posted detailed equipment lists and safety protocols, seeming to believe that technical preparation could eliminate the inherent dangers of approaching an apex predator. "Fear is the enemy of great photography," he wrote in response to concerned comments. "I trust my skills and my understanding of jaguar behavior." Meanwhile, disturbing reports from the field continued to accumulate. On March 11th, a group of tourists on a guided fishing trip reported that a large jaguar had approached their boat to within 15 meters, showing no fear when guides shouted and made noise. The jaguar had simply observed the group for several minutes before disappearing into the vegetation. "It was like he was studying us," tourist Sarah Mitchell later reported. "Not hunting behavior, more like curiosity mixed with something that felt almost predatory." Research station manager Carlos Medina documented 3 separate incidents between March 10th and 13th where Odorongo 8 had been spotted during daylight hours, each time closer to human activity areas. "This cat has lost all normal behavioral patterns," Medina reported to his supervisors. "He's active during peak human activity hours and showing no avoidance responses to noise or movement." Local indigenous communities had begun implementing emergency protocols, restricting river travel to large groups and avoiding certain areas entirely. Shipibo leader Teresa Campos called an emergency community meeting on March 12th, where elders discussed the spiritual implications of the jaguar's behavior. "Our ancestors teach us that when predators lose their natural balance, it means the forest itself is sick," Campos explained. "This jaguar carries darkness that threatens both our people and himself." The final warning came on March 14, just hours before Luis launched his expedition. Dr. Rojas made a personal visit to the research station where Luis was staying, bringing with her detailed documentation of the Jaguar's escalating behavioral problems. "I'm asking you one final time to reconsider," she told Luis. "This animal has exhibited every warning sign of a potentially dangerous predator. Your presence in his territory tomorrow could trigger an aggressive response." Luis thanked Dr. Rojas for her concern but remained unmoved. "I appreciate your scientific perspective," he told her, "but I believe you're overestimating the danger. Jaguars are ambush predators. They attack prey animals and photographers who maintain respectful distance." When Dr. Rojas pointed out that jaguars had occasionally attacked humans in other regions, Luis dismissed these incidents as cases of mistaken identity or defensive behavior. That evening, as Luis performed final equipment checks and reviewed his photography plans, Cesar Tenanta made one last desperate attempt to change his mind. The indigenous guide arrived at the research station after dark, bringing with him traditional offerings that he said were meant to appease the forest spirits. "My grandfather came to me in dreams," Cesar told Luis. "He said the great cat is no longer just a jaguar, something else moves with him now. If you go tomorrow, you will not return the same man." Luis politely accepted the offerings but dismissed the spiritual warnings as cultural superstition. He spent his final evening updating his photography blog with optimistic predictions about the next day's shoot. "Tomorrow I attempt to capture images that could redefine wildlife photography," he wrote. "If successful, these photographs will show the world that coexistence between humans and apex predators is possible through understanding and respect." As Luis fell asleep that night, less than 3 kilometers away, Otorongo 18 was moving through the darkness toward the exact stretch of river where the photographer planned to begin his work at sunrise. The jaguar's massive paws left deep impressions in the muddy riverbank, and his territorial scent markings grew stronger and more frequent as he approached the area Luis had chosen for his base camp location. Wednesday, March 15, 5:47 a.m. The pre-dawn air along the Madre de Dios River hung thick with moisture and the sounds of awakening jungle life. Mist rose from the dark water like ghostly fingers, and the calls of howler monkeys echoed through the canopy, announcing the beginning of another day in one of Earth's most biodiverse ecosystems. The temperature held steady at 78 degrees Fahrenheit, with humidity near 95%, perfect conditions for the wildlife photography Luis had been planning for months. Luis Vargas had been awake since 4:30 a.m., performing final equipment checks by the light of his headlamp at the research station dock. His specialized Canon EOS R5 camera body was fitted with a 600mm telephoto lens, capable of capturing intimate detail from what he considered a safe distance. Backup cameras, extra batteries, memory cards, and emergency supplies were carefully arranged in waterproof cases throughout his reinforced aluminum canoe. He had even installed a small electric motor to supplement his paddle, ensuring silent approach capabilities that wouldn't disturb the wildlife he hoped to encounter. His plan was methodical and appeared well-researched. Luis intended to navigate upstream to a bend in the river, approximately 8 kilometers from the research station, where fresh jaguar tracks had been documented just 3 days earlier. Satellite imagery showed a natural clay lick on the eastern bank where various animals came to drink and consume mineral-rich soil. The location offered multiple photography angles and, most importantly, escape routes if the situation became uncomfortable. Otorongo 18 had been active throughout the night. Indigenous tracker Miguel Yambato, who was monitoring the jaguar's movements as part of an ongoing research project, later reported finding fresh tracks that showed the great cat had been patrolling the riverbank between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. The tracks revealed a pattern that concerned Yambato. Rather than the typical hunting circuit jaguars follow, Otorongo 18 appeared to be focusing his attention on a specific area of riverbank that corresponded exactly with Luis's planned photography location. At 6:15 a.m., Luis pushed his canoe into the slow-moving current and began paddling upstream. The morning light was soft and golden, filtering through the canopy in shafts that illuminated the mist rising from the water. For Luis, this was the magical hour he had been dreaming about, the time when nocturnal predators might still be active while providing enough light for spectacular photography. He felt confident, prepared, and excited about the possibilities that lay ahead. Research Station Manager Dr. Elena Rodriguez had risen early to see Luis off, though her concerns about the expedition remained strong. She watched from the dock as his canoe disappeared around the first bend, noting in her logbook, L. Vargas departed 6:15 a.m. for solo photography expedition. Weather conditions optimal. Subject advised of emergency. Radio protocols and expected return time of 4 p.m. Concerns about recent Jaguar behavioral reports expressed but dismissed by subject. Luis's journey upstream was initially peaceful and routine. He documented his progress with a small action camera, narrating his expectations and observations for what he planned to edit into a behind-the-scenes video. "The forest is absolutely alive this morning," he whispered into the camera at 6:45 a.m. "I can hear at least 6 different bird species, and the monkey calls suggest active feeding behavior in the canopy. Perfect conditions for wildlife encounters." At 7:20 a.m., Luis reached the confluence where a smaller tributary joined the main river. This was his first checkpoint, where he planned to assess conditions and make final decisions about his approach route. As he maneuvered his canoe into a quiet backwater to review his maps, Luis noticed something that should have served as a warning. The forest had become unusually quiet. The constant chatter of birds and monkeys had faded to almost nothing, replaced by an eerie stillness that experienced jungle travelers recognize as a sign of predator presence. But Luis, focused on his photography mission and excited about the possibilities ahead, interpreted the silence differently. The quiet suggests larger animals might be moving through the area, he noted in his camera narration. "This could be exactly what I'm hoping for, a sign that the jaguar is active and potentially visible for photography." Odorongo 18 was indeed active, but not in the way Luis anticipated. The massive jaguar had been tracking the canoes' progress from the dense vegetation along the riverbank, moving parallel to Luis's route while remaining completely invisible. Jaguars are masters of stealth, capable of moving through thick jungle without making a sound, and Odorongo 18 was using every bit of his natural hunting ability to monitor this intruder in his territory. At 7:35 a.m., Luis resumed his upstream journey, paddling steadily toward the clay lick location he had marked on his to-dos. The morning light continued to improve, and he began setting up his camera equipment for quick deployment. When photographic opportunities arose, his excitement was building as he approached the area where Jaguar sign had been most concentrated. What Luis didn't know was that Odorongo 18 had already claimed the clay lick area as his morning territory. The Jaguar had spent the previous hours scent marking trees and establishing his presence in preparation for what appeared to be a territorial challenge from the approaching human. In the Jaguar's mind, Luis's steady approach represented an invasion that demanded response. At 7:52 a.m., Luis reached the outside edge of the clay lick area. The location was even more perfect than he had hoped. A natural clearing where the riverbank opened into a small beach of mineral-rich soil, surrounded by dense forest that would provide excellent camouflage for wildlife photography. He carefully positioned his canoe approximately 50 meters from the bank, close enough for spectacular photographs but far enough, he believed, to maintain safety margins. As Luis began setting up his primary camera system, he noticed fresh tracks in the mud along the shoreline. Round paw prints with clear claw marks, unmistakably jaguar and extremely recent. His heart rate quickened with excitement rather than concern. "Perfect," he whispered into his recording device. "Fresh jaguar sign exactly where predicted. The cat was here within the last few hours, possibly even watching me right now." That last observation was more accurate than Luis realized. Less than 40 meters away, concealed in a tangle of vegetation and fallen logs. Otorongo 18 was indeed watching. The Jaguar's golden eyes tracked every movement as Luis arranged his equipment and settled into position for what the photographer hoped would be a long but rewarding. At 8:10 a.m., Luis made his first critical mistake. Eager to get closer shots of the tracks and territorial markings he had observed, he used his paddle to maneuver his canoe closer to shore, reducing his distance from the bank to approximately 30 meters. This movement brought him well within the Jaguar's established strike range, though Luis remained unaware of the predator's presence. Otorongo 18's body language shifted as the canoe moved closer. What had been curious observation transformed into something more focused and potentially dangerous. The Jaguar's muscles tensed, his tail began moving in slow, controlled movements, and his breathing changed to the shallow pattern that precedes a hunting strike. Every instinct, honed by millions of years of evolution, was telling him that the time for action was approaching. Luis spent several minutes photographing the shoreline, capturing images of tracks, territorial markings, and the natural beauty of the clay lick environment. His excitement continued to build as he documented evidence of recent Jaguar activity. "This is incredible," he narrated quietly. "The concentration of sign here suggests this is a major territorial focal point. If I'm patient, there's an excellent chance the cat will return to investigate my presence." At 8:25 a.m., as Luis was changing camera lenses and adjusting his position for better lighting angles, the forest around him began to change in subtle ways that his excitement prevented him from noticing. Bird alarm calls started in the canopy above, short, sharp warning notes that indicated predator movement. Small animals began fleeing through the underbrush, creating rustling sounds that should have alerted Luis to approaching danger. Instead, Luis interpreted these sounds as positive signs. Increased animal activity, he noted in his narration. "Something is definitely moving through the area. This could be exactly what I've been waiting for." Otorongo 18 had begun his final approach, moving with the fluid grace that makes jaguars such effective predators. The great cat advanced through the vegetation toward a position that would give him multiple attack options. His route took him to within 20 meters of Luis's canoe, close enough to launch a devastating ambush if the situation demanded it. At 8:33 a.m., Luis caught his first glimpse of what he had traveled so far to see. A flash of golden fur moved through the shadows at the edge of the clay lick clearing, brief and indistinct, but unmistakably feline. Luis's heart pounded with excitement as he raised his camera and began scanning the tree line through his telephoto lens. "Contact," he whispered into his recording device, his voice tight with anticipation. "I have visual contact with what appears to be a large cat moving through the vegetation approximately 40 meters from my position. This is it, this is the moment I've been preparing for." But as Luis focused his attention on capturing the perfect photograph, he failed to notice that Otorongo 18 was no longer hiding. The massive jaguar had emerged from concealment and was now clearly visible on the riverbank, his powerful body positioned in a classic pre-attack crouch. The great cat's golden eyes were locked onto Luis's canoe, and his tail had begun the rhythmic switching motion that indicates imminent action. The distance between predator and photographer had shrunk to less than 25 meters. For a jaguar of Otorongo 18's size and athletic ability, this represented point-blank range. At 8:34 a.m., Otorongo 18 made his decision. The massive jaguar exploded from his crouched position with the terrifying speed that makes these cats such deadly predators. In a single, fluid motion that covered 25 meters. In less than 3 seconds, the 280-pound jaguar launched himself through the air and landed directly in Luis's canoe. With a thunderous crash that sent equipment flying and nearly capsized the small vessel. Luis's first reaction was pure shock. The camera he had been holding flew from his hands as the canoe rocked violently under the impact of the jaguar's landing. "Dios mío," he screamed, his voice cracking with terror as he found himself face to face with one of nature's most powerful predators. The jaguar's massive head was less than 2 feet from his own, golden eyes blazing with an intensity that seemed to look straight through him. Odorongo 8's initial contact was not immediately aggressive, it was investigative, almost curious. The great cat's powerful claws gripped the sides of the aluminum canoe, his weight causing the vessel to ride dangerously low in the water. For a moment that felt like eternity, predator and photographer stared at each other, both seeming to assess this unprecedented situation. Luis could smell the jaguar's breath, hear the deep rumbling in its chest, feel the incredible power radiating from its muscled frame. Dr. Maria Santos, a jaguar behavior specialist who later analyzed witness accounts and physical evidence, explains what likely occurred in those first crucial seconds. Odorongo 8 was not initially attacking, he was investigating an intruder in his territory. Jaguars are naturally curious animals, and this individual had become habituated to human presence over months of observation. His leap into the canoe was likely an attempt to understand what Luis represented in his territorial landscape. But Luis, terrified and operating purely on adrenaline, made a critical error in judgment. Instead of remaining motionless and allowing the jaguar to complete his investigation, Luis panicked and tried to push the cat away with his paddle. The wooden oar struck Odorongo 8 across the shoulder, not hard enough to cause injury but sufficient to trigger the jaguar's defensive instincts. The change in the jaguar's demeanor was instantaneous and devastating. What had been curious investigation transformed into focused aggression as Odorongo 8's hunting instincts engaged. His ears flattened against his skull, his lips pulled back to reveal massive canine teeth, and a deep, menacing growl rumbled from his chest. The great cat's claws extended fully, puncturing through the aluminum sides of the canoe and creating the first of what would become multiple hull breaches. Luis tried desperately to maintain his balance as water began pouring into the damaged canoe. "Help me," he screamed, though no one was within kilometers of his location. His emergency radio had been thrown into the river during the initial impact, eliminating his only means of calling for assistance. The paddle he had used to strike the jaguar floated just out of reach, leaving him defenseless against 280 pounds of aroused predator. Odorongo 8's response to Luis's defensive action was swift and overwhelming. The jaguar's right front paw struck Luis across the chest with enough force to knock him backward into the stern of the canoe. 4 parallel claw marks tore through his photography vest and drew blood across his ribs, though the wounds were not immediately life-threatening. The real danger came from the jaguar's continued presence in the rapidly sinking vessel. Wildlife attack survivor and expert James Patterson, who has studied dozens of big cat encounters, later explained the psychological dynamics at play. Once Luis struck the jaguar, he transformed from a curious intruder into a perceived threat. Jaguars don't engage in warning displays like some other big cats. When they decide to neutralize a threat, they do so with maximum efficiency and violence. As the canoe continued taking on water, Luis realized his only chance for survival was to get out of the confined space, where the jaguar held every advantage. With water now up to his waist and the vessel becoming increasingly unstable, Luis made the desperate decision to abandon the canoe and try to reach the riverbank. He rolled backward over the stern and into the murky water of the Madre de Dios. The moment Luis entered the water, Odorongo 8's hunting instincts fully engaged. Jaguars are among the few big cats that actively hunt in aquatic environments, and water represented the jaguar's preferred killing ground rather than an escape route for his prey. With a powerful leap that carried him 8 feet through the air, the great cat abandoned the sinking canoe and plunged into the river in pursuit of Luis. Luis had perhaps 10 seconds in the water before Odorongo 8 reached him. During those crucial moments, he managed to swim approximately 15 meters toward the riverbank, his photography equipment weighing him down. But his adrenaline providing strength he didn't know he possessed. Behind him, he could hear the powerful strokes of the jaguar cutting through the water with terrifying efficiency. When Odorongo 8 caught up to Luis, the attack intensified dramatically. The jaguar's powerful jaws clamped down on Luis's left shoulder, and the photographer felt the crushing pressure of teeth designed to pierce caiman skulls. The pain was indescribable, not just the puncture wounds from the jaguar's canines, but the tremendous pressure as those jaws began to close with over 1,500 pounds per square inch of bite force. The sensation was like being caught in a mechanical vice, Luis later described to medical personnel. But worse than the pain was the realization that this animal could crush my bones effortlessly if it chose to. I could feel its breath on my neck, hear the rumbling growl vibrating through its chest into my body. Otorongo-8's attack strategy followed classic jaguar hunting patterns. Rather than releasing and striking again, Great Cat maintained his grip on Luis's shoulder while using his powerful hind legs to rake downward along the photographer's back and sides. The jaguar's rear claws, each nearly 2 inches long, tore through Luis's clothing and flesh, creating deep parallel wounds from his shoulder blade to his lower ribs. As the attack continued in the water, both predator and prey began moving toward the riverbank. Otorongo-8's natural instinct was to drag his prey to solid ground where he could deliver the killing bite that jaguars typically use to dispatch their victims. Luis, fighting against shock and blood loss, realized that reaching the bank might mean rather than safety. In a moment of desperate inspiration, Luis remembered advice from a wildlife documentary he had seen years earlier about escaping from crocodile attacks. Instead of trying to pull away from the jaguar's grip, which would only cause more tissue damage, he forced himself to go limp and motionless in the water. The sudden cessation of struggling confused Otorongo-8 momentarily, causing the jaguar to loosen his grip slightly while assessing whether his prey had been subdued. That momentary loosening gave Luis the opportunity he needed. With the last of his strength, he managed to grab a handful of river mud and debris and fling it directly into the jaguar's face and eyes. The Great Cat instinctively released his grip and shook his head to clear his vision, giving Luis precious seconds to put distance between himself and his attacker. Luis used those seconds to reach a partially submerged log that extended into the river from the bank. Climbing onto the log brought him out of the water but also closer to shore and closer to Otorongo-8's preferred hunting territory. Behind him, the jaguar had cleared his eyes and was once again advancing, this time more cautiously but with obvious intent to finish what he had started. What happened next would define the remainder of Luis's ordeal. As Otorongo-8 approached the log where Luis had taken refuge, the photographer made another desperate decision. Rather than waiting to be dragged into the jungle, where his body might never be found, Luis chose to fight back with the only weapon available to him, a broken piece of aluminum from his destroyed canoe that had washed up against the log. The sight of Luis wielding the makeshift weapon seemed to trigger something new in Otorongo-8's behavior. Instead of pressing his attack, the jaguar paused approximately 10 feet away, his tail switching with agitation but his posture suggesting uncertainty rather than immediate aggression. For several minutes, predator and prey faced each other in a deadly standoff, both breathing heavily and assessing their options. Dr. Santos later theorized that this pause represented a critical moment in the encounter. Jaguars are opportunistic hunters that prefer easy kills. When prey fights back effectively, especially prey that doesn't fit their normal hunting patterns, they often reassess whether the energy expenditure is worth the potential reward. Luis's refusal to behave like typical prey may have confused Otorongo-8's hunting instincts. But the standoff couldn't last forever. Luis was losing blood from multiple wounds, his strength was failing, and he was still trapped in the jaguar's territory with no clear escape route. As the minutes passed, Otorongo-8's confidence seemed to return, and the Great Cat began moving closer to the log where Luis had taken his desperate refuge. That's when Luis made the decision that would ultimately save his life. Instead of waiting for the jaguar to resume his attack, he chose to abandon his defensive position and make a run for the dense jungle behind him. It was a calculated gamble, trading the relative safety of his current position for the possibility of finding better cover or even rescue. Among the trees. As Luis broke from the log and sprinted toward the jungle, Odorongo Aiton's hunting instincts triggered once more. The sight of fleeing prey activated every predatory instinct the great cat possessed, and he launched himself in pursuit with renewed determination. The chase that followed would test every survival skill Luis had ever learned and push both man and jaguar to their absolute limits. 10:47 a.m., Research Station Manager Dr. Elena Rodriguez first realized something was wrong when Luis failed to respond to his scheduled radio check-in. Standard protocol required all solo researchers to make contact every 2 hours, and Luis's silence immediately triggered emergency procedures that had been established precisely for situations like this. Base station to Luis Vargas, please respond. Dr. Rodriguez called repeatedly into her radio, her voice growing more urgent with each unanswered transmission. The crackling static that came back instead of Luis's familiar voice sent chills down her spine. She knew the photographer's meticulous nature. He would never miss a scheduled check-in without serious cause. By 11:15 a.m., Dr. Rodriguez had activated the research station's emergency response protocol. Her first call went to Carlos Medina, the regional coordinator for wildlife emergencies, who immediately understood the gravity of the situation. Given the recent jaguar behavioral reports, we have to assume this is a predator-related emergency. Medina told Rodriguez, I'm dispatching our rapid response team immediately, but it will take them at least 90 minutes to reach your location. The emergency response team consisted of Wildlife Officer Captain Miguel Santos, paramedic specialists Elena Vasquez and Roberto Silva, and indigenous tracker Cesar Tenanta, the same guide who had repeatedly warned Luis about Odorongo Aiton's dangerous behavior. When Cesar received the emergency call, his first words were grimly prophetic. I told him this would happen. The great cat has claimed him. Meanwhile, 15 kilometers upriver, Luis was fighting for his life in ways he had never imagined possible. Through the jungle had lasted nearly 2 hours, with Odorongo Aiton pursuing him relentlessly through dense undergrowth that tore at his wounds and sapped his remaining strength. Luis had managed to stay ahead of the jaguar. By using every piece of jungle survival knowledge he had accumulated over years of wildlife photography, but he knew he couldn't maintain this pace much longer. At 12:30 p.m., the emergency response team launched their high-speed riverboat from the research station dock. Captain Santos had assembled additional resources, including a medical helicopter on standby in Puerto Maldonado, and backup wildlife officers from 3 different stations. We're preparing for the worst-case scenario, Santos radioed to his command center. Full trauma response and potential dangerous animal removal. The boat team's journey upstream was complicated by the need to search every possible location where Luis might have encountered trouble. Tracker Cesar studied the riverbank through binoculars, looking for signs of disturbance, blood, or equipment that might indicate where the photographer had run into difficulty. The muddy water made it impossible to see submerged debris, and the dense vegetation along the banks could hide evidence from all but the most experienced eyes. At 1:15 p.m., they found Luis's destroyed canoe. The aluminum vessel had washed up against a fallen tree approximately 9 kilometers from the research station, its hull punctured by what were unmistakably large claw marks. Scattered equipment floated in the nearby water, camera cases, empty water bottles, and fragments of Luis's distinctive red photography vest. The scene told a clear story of violent encounter. Jaguar attack confirmed. Captain Santos radioed to headquarters. We have a destroyed canoe with claw damage and scattered personal effects. Beginning immediate search for the victim. Paramedic Vasquez examined the fabric. Fragments caught on nearby branches, noting the blood stains and the pattern of tears that suggested a large predator's involvement. Cesar Tenanta was studying tracks in the muddy riverbank when he made a discovery that changed everything. Captain, he called urgently, pointing to a set of human footprints leading away from the water. The photographer is alive. These tracks are fresh, maybe 2 hours old. But the Jaguar tracks follow the same path. The realization that Luis had survived the initial encounter and was potentially still alive in the jungle triggered an immediate escalation of the response effort. Captain Santos called in the medical helicopter and requested additional tracking teams from indigenous communities throughout the region. "We have a survivor situation," he broadcast. "Injured victim on foot in Jaguar territory. Maximum response authorized." As the ground team prepared to follow the tracks into the dense jungle, Luis was approximately 3 kilometers away. Using skills he had never thought he would need to survive, he had managed to put temporary distance between himself and Odorongo 8 by climbing a massive cecropia tree, but the Jaguar remained nearby, occasionally visible through the foliage as it patrolled the area below. Luis's condition was deteriorating rapidly. The shoulder wound from the Jaguar's initial bite had become infected, despite his attempts to clean it with river water, and the claw marks across his back continued to seep blood. Dangerous was the onset of shock. His hands shook uncontrollably, his vision blurred periodically, and he struggled to maintain rational thought processes. At 2:45 p.m., the tracking team made their first significant breakthrough. Caesar discovered a makeshift bandage that Luis had torn from his shirt and discarded after it became too blood-soaked to be useful. The fabric was still damp, indicating they were closing the gap between themselves and the missing photographer. More importantly, the direction of the tracks suggested Luis was moving toward an area of jungle where indigenous hunting trails might provide easier access for rescue vehicles. "We're maybe 2 hours behind him," Caesar reported to Captain Santos. "But the blood trail is getting heavier. This man is seriously injured and may not be able to continue much longer." The tracker also noted with concern that the Jaguar's tracks continued to parallel Luis's route, suggesting the predator had not abandoned his pursuit. The medical helicopter arrived at 3:20 p.m., piloted by Captain Rosa Martinez with trauma specialist Dr. Fernando Lopez. Aboard, the aircraft began aerial reconnaissance of the jungle area where Luis was believed to be located, using thermal imaging equipment to search for human heat signatures among the dense canopy. The challenge was enormous, millions of acres of unbroken rainforest with countless animals that could confuse thermal readings. On the ground, the tracking team pressed deeper into increasingly difficult terrain. The jungle floor was a maze of fallen trees, swampy areas, and thorn-covered vines that slowed their progress and made communication difficult. Captain Santos maintained radio contact with the helicopter crew, coordinating search patterns and sharing GPS coordinates as the ground team followed Luis's trail. At 4:10 p.m., Dr. Lopez spotted something through the helicopter's thermal imaging system. "I have a possible human heat signature," he reported to the ground team. "Large heat source in a tree approximately 800 meters northeast of your current position. Stationary for at least 10 minutes, which could indicate injury or exhaustion." The ground team changed direction and pushed through increasingly dense vegetation toward the coordinates provided by the helicopter. Caesar noted that the Jaguar tracks had become more erratic in this area, suggesting Odorongo 8 was also aware of the approaching rescue team and might be becoming agitated by the unusual activity in his territory. Luis heard the helicopter long before he saw it. The rhythmic beating of rotor blades was the most beautiful sound he had ever experienced, proof that his radio silence had triggered a search and rescue operation. From his position 30 feet up in the cecropia tree, he could see the aircraft circling the area, and he began waving frantically with his uninjured arm while shouting at the top of his lungs. "There!" Dr. Lopez called out from the helicopter. "I can see him. Human subject in a large tree, appears to be conscious and mobile." The relief in the medical specialist's voice was evident as he radioed the coordinates to the ground team and began assessing possibilities for aerial rescue. Captain Santos and his team reached Luis's tree at 4:35 p.m., nearly 6 hours after he had first encountered Odorongo 8. The photographer's condition was immediately concerning, He was conscious but clearly suffering from significant blood loss, shock, and exhaustion. His left shoulder showed obvious signs of infection around deep puncture wounds, and the claw marks across his back had torn through multiple layers of tissue. "Luis, can you hear me?" Captain Santos called up to the photographer. "We're here to get you out. Are you able to climb down, or do we need to bring you down?" Luis's response was weak but coherent. "I can try to climb down, but there's a jaguar nearby. It's been following me for hours. You need to be careful, this cat is not normal." Even as the rescue team worked to extract Luis from the tree, Cesar Tenanta was scanning the surrounding jungle for signs of Otorongo 18. The tracker found fresh jaguar sign less than 50 meters from the rescue site, including territorial markings that suggested the great cat was aware of the human activity but had chosen to observe from a distance rather than confront the larger group. Paramedic Vasquez began treating Luis's injuries even before he reached the ground, passing medical supplies up the tree and talking him through basic first aid procedures. "The bleeding from your back has mostly stopped," she called up to him, "but that shoulder wound needs immediate attention. We're going to get you down and to medical care as quickly as possible." The extraction took nearly 40 minutes as the team carefully lowered Luis from the tree while maintaining security. Watch for the jaguar they knew was nearby. Once on the ground, Dr. Vasquez performed a rapid assessment of his injuries and determined that helicopter evacuation was necessary. Severe bite wounds, multiple lacerations, signs of infection and shock. She radioed to the medical helicopter. Priority evacuation required. At 5:20 p.m., Luis was lifted from the jungle floor in a rescue harness and transported to the helicopter, which immediately departed for the regional hospital in Puerto Maldonado. As the aircraft disappeared over the canopy, Cesar Tenanta spotted Otorongo 18 watching from the shadows at the edge of the clearing, his golden eyes following the departure of the prey that had escaped his grasp. Luis Vargas arrived at Hospital Nacional dos de Mayo in Puerto Maldonado at 6:15 p.m., his condition listed as critical but stable. The trauma team, led by Dr. Carmen Mendoza, had been prepared for his arrival and immediately began the complex process of treating injuries that few medical professionals ever encounter. The bite wounds on his shoulder required extensive cleaning and surgical repair, while the claw marks across his back needed careful assessment for nerve and muscle damage. "In 30 years of emergency medicine, I had never treated jaguar attack injuries," Dr. Mendoza later explained. "The bite wounds were unlike anything we typically see, perfectly circular punctures that went deep into muscle tissue with crushing injuries from the pressure of the jaguar's jaws. The infection risk was enormous, and we had to assume the wounds contained bacteria from the animal's mouth that could cause life-threatening sepsis." Luis underwent emergency surgery that lasted 4 hours. The surgical team worked to repair torn muscles in his shoulder, clean infected tissue from the bite wounds, and suture the extensive claw marks that covered his back and sides. Most challenging was addressing the psychological trauma that accompanied his physical injuries. Luis had survived an encounter that few humans ever experience and lived to tell about it. Isabella Martinez, Luis's girlfriend, received the news of his attack while at work at her veterinary clinic in Cusco. The phone call from hospital officials left her speechless with shock and terror. "When they told me Luis had been attacked by a jaguar, I couldn't process it at first," Isabella later recalled. "It seemed impossible, like something from a nightmare, rather than real life. All I could think about were our last conversations, how I had begged him not to go alone." Isabella caught the first available flight to Puerto Maldonado, arriving at the hospital just as Luis was being moved from surgery to intensive care. Her first sight of him, heavily bandaged, connected to multiple monitoring devices, and sedated for pain management, was overwhelming. "He looked so small in that hospital bed," she said. "This man who had always seemed so confident and capable in the jungle looked fragile and vulnerable." The medical team's primary concerns extended beyond Luis's immediate injuries. Dr. Mendoza explained to Isabella that jaguar attacks carry unique risks due to the bacteria in the cat's mouths and claws. We're treating him with broad-spectrum antibiotics to prevent sepsis, she explained, but we have to monitor for signs of exotic infections that we rarely see in human patients. The next 48 hours will be critical. Meanwhile, back in the jungle where the attack occurred, wildlife officials faced a difficult decision about Odorongo 8's fate. Captain Miguel Santos had remained at the attack site with a team of wildlife specialists to assess the jaguar's continued behavior and determine what action, if any, needed to be taken. The great cat had not left the area, continuing to patrol the territory where he had encountered Luis. Dr. Patricia Rojas, the carnivore specialist who had repeatedly warned Luis about the jaguar's dangerous behavior, arrived at the scene on March 16 to conduct a behavioral assessment. Her findings were deeply troubling. Odorongo 8 showed no signs of fear or avoidance despite the helicopter activity and human presence during the rescue operation, she documented in her report. This level of habituation to humans, combined with his proven willingness to attack, represents an ongoing danger to anyone entering his territory. The decision about the jaguar's fate sparked intense debate among conservation officials. Peru's Environmental Ministry received dozens of calls from international wildlife organizations arguing that Odorongo 8 should be relocated rather than destroyed. However, local officials pointed out that the jaguar's size and behavioral problems made relocation extremely difficult and potentially dangerous to other communities. Luis's family arrived in Puerto Maldonado throughout the day on March 16. His parents, Carlos and Maria Elena Vargas, were devastated by news of their son's attack but grateful he had survived. We always worried about Luis's work, Maria Elena told reporters. But we never imagined something like this could happen. Jaguars were supposed to avoid humans, that's what all the experts always said. The story of Luis's attack quickly gained national and international attention. News outlets throughout Peru picked up the story, and wildlife photography communities around the world followed his recovery with intense interest. Social media exploded with debates about wildlife photography ethics, safety protocols, and the risks of habituating wild predators to human presence. Miguel Santos, Luis's closest friend, felt tremendous guilt about not forcing his way onto the expedition. I should have insisted on going with him, Miguel told reporters. I knew he was becoming obsessed with getting that perfect jaguar shot, but I thought his experience would keep him safe. I'll never forgive myself for not being there when he needed help. On March 18, Luis regained full consciousness for the first time since his surgery. His first words to Isabella were an apology. I'm sorry. You were right. I should have listened. The emotional reunion was complicated by Luis's realization of how close he had come to death and how his obsession with photography had nearly cost him everything he valued. Dr. Mendoza reported that Luis's physical recovery was progressing better than expected. The surgical repairs to his shoulder were healing well, and the infection that had threatened his life was responding to antibiotic treatment. However, she noted signs of psychological trauma that would require long-term treatment. Surviving a predator attack creates complex psychological issues, she explained. Mr. Vargas will need extensive therapy to process this experience. The investigation into the attack's causes revealed a series of warning signs that had been ignored or dismissed. Officials discovered that Odorongo 8 had been displaying dangerous behavior for months, with multiple reports from guides and researchers that had not resulted in protective action. The case became a textbook example of how wildlife management failures can create dangerous situations for both humans and animals. On March 20th, after extensive consultation with international wildlife experts, officials made the difficult decision to tranquilize and relocate Odorongo 8 to a remote area of Manu National Park, over 200 kilometers from any human activity. The operation required a team of specialists and cost over $15,000, but it represented a compromise between public safety and conservation concerns. Luis's recovery continued slowly but steadily. By March 25, he was able to sit up in bed and speak with investigators about his experience. His detailed account of the attack provided valuable insights into Jaguar behavior that would be used to improve safety protocols for researchers throughout the Amazon region. I want other people to learn from my mistakes, Luis told officials. This should never happen to anyone else. The attack had profound effects on Luis's career and personal life. Photography equipment manufacturers began developing new safety devices for wildlife photographers, including emergency beacons and predator deterrent systems. Conservation organizations revised their protocols for studying dangerous wildlife, implementing mandatory safety procedures that Luis's case had shown were critically necessary. Isabella never left Luis's side during his month-long hospital stay. Their relationship, tested by the trauma of his near-death experience, emerged stronger than before. This attack changed both of us, Isabella explained. Luis realized that no photograph is worth dying for, and I learned how much I truly love him. We're planning to get married as soon as he's fully recovered. The financial impact of Luis's attack was substantial. Medical bills exceeded $50,000, and his inability to work meant loss of income from several contracted photography projects. However, the wildlife photography community rallied around him, organizing fundraising efforts that helped cover his expenses and demonstrated the solidarity that exists among people who face similar risks in their professional work. By April 15, Luis was finally released from the hospital, though his recovery was far from complete. Physical therapy would be required for months to restore full function to his injured shoulder, and psychological counseling would help him process the trauma of his life-threatening encounter. The claw scars across his back would remain visible reminders of how close he had come to becoming another statistic in human-wildlife conflict. The community impact of Luis's attack extended far beyond his personal recovery. Tourism operators throughout the Madre de Dios region implemented new safety protocols, and wildlife viewing activities were restructured to maintain safer distances from potentially dangerous animals. The case became a catalyst for improved communication between researchers, local communities, and wildlife management authorities. Luis's first public statement, released through social media on April 20th, focused on lessons learned rather than blame. I want people to understand that wildlife deserves our respect, not our overconfidence. I made mistakes that nearly cost me my life, but I also learned that survival is possible if you refuse to give up. This experience has changed how I see my relationship with the natural world, and I hope it can help others avoid similar dangers. Dr. Patricia Rojas, Peru's leading jaguar behavior specialist with over 15 years of field research experience, conducted the most comprehensive analysis of Luis Vargas's attack ever undertaken for a human-jaguar encounter. Her findings, published in the Journal of Wildlife Management, revealed disturbing patterns that challenged conventional understanding of jaguar behavior and human-wildlife interactions. This was not a typical predatory attack, Dr. Rojas explained in her detailed report. Odorongo 18 exhibited a complex sequence of behaviors that suggest a breakdown in normal jaguar territorial and hunting patterns. The initial approach to Luis's canoe was investigative rather than aggressive, but the situation escalated when the jaguar interpreted defensive actions as threatening behavior. This case demonstrates how habituation to human presence can create unpredictable and dangerous scenarios. Dr. Rojas identified several critical factors that contributed to the attack's severity. Odorongo 18's prolonged exposure to human activity had eroded his natural fear response, making him more likely to investigate rather than avoid human encounters. The jaguar's territorial behavior had become increasingly focused on areas of human activity, suggesting he was beginning to incorporate humans into his territorial calculations. Most concerning was evidence that the jaguar had been actively tracking human movements for weeks before the attack occurred. Animal behaviorist Dr. James Mitchell, who specializes in predator psychology, provided additional insights into the attack sequence. His analysis focused on the moment-by-moment decision-making process that transformed a curious encounter into a life-threatening situation. When Luis struck Otorongo Aiton with the paddle, he triggered a predator response that had been building for months, Dr. Mitchell explained. Jaguars are unlike other big cats in their response to perceived threats. They don't engage in warning displays or ritualized aggression. When a jaguar decides to attack, does so with overwhelming force designed to end the encounter quickly. The medical analysis of Luis's injuries provided crucial data about jaguar attack patterns and survival factors. Fernando Lopez, the trauma specialist who treated Luis in the field, documented wound patterns that revealed the jaguar's precise hunting methodology. The bite wounds on Luis's shoulder showed the classic jaguar killing technique. A crushing grip designed to disable prey through massive tissue damage and potential spinal injury. The fact that Luis survived this initial attack suggests either that Otorongo Aiton was not fully committed to killing, or that Luis's defensive actions disrupted the jaguar's normal attack sequence. Dr. Lopez's analysis revealed that Luis's survival depended on several critical factors. His physical fitness allowed him to maintain mobility despite serious injuries, while his knowledge of jungle environments helped him make tactical decisions that kept him ahead of his pursuer. Most importantly, his refusal to behave like typical prey animals confused the jaguar's hunting instincts and may have prevented a more sustained attack. Survival expert Maria Santos, who has studied dozens of predator attack cases throughout South America, emphasized the psychological factors that determined Luis's survival. Most people who survive predator attacks share common characteristics. They refuse to accept death as inevitable, they make rational decisions under extreme stress, and they use every available resource to stay alive. Luis demonstrated all of these traits, but he also benefited from the jaguar's own behavioral confusion about how to respond to such an unusual prey animal. Dr. Santos identified specific survival strategies that proved effective during Luis's ordeal. His decision to go limp in the water when first seized disrupted the jaguar's killing sequence, while his use of environmental materials as weapons forced the predator to reassess the threat level. His ability to climb trees and use elevated positions as refuge points allowed him to control engagement distances and force the jaguar to operate outside its preferred ambush parameters. Wildlife photographer and safety consultant Ricardo Vargas, who has documented predator encounters throughout the Amazon for 20 years, analyzed the equipment and procedural failures that contributed to the attack's severity. Luis made several critical mistakes that violated basic wildlife photography safety protocols, Vargas explained. He worked alone in a high-risk environment, failed to maintain adequate escape distances, and ignored clear warning signs about the specific animal he was attempting to photograph. Vargas's technical analysis revealed that Luis's equipment setup actually increased his vulnerability to attack. To use a canoe rather than a larger, more stable boat limited his mobility options and brought him within the jaguar's preferred attack range. His focus on getting closer shots compromised safety margins that more experienced photographers maintain even when working with less dangerous subjects. The psychological analysis conducted by Dr. Elena Vasquez revealed the mental processes that led Luis to ignore obvious danger signs and make increasingly risky decisions. Mr. Vargas exhibited classic symptoms of what we call goal fixation syndrome, a psychological state where desire for a specific outcome overrides rational risk assessment. This is common among high-achievement individuals who become emotionally invested in challenging objectives. Dr. Vasquez identified warning signs that Luis's friends and family could have recognized months before the attack occurred. His increasing isolation from social support networks, his dismissive attitude toward expert warnings, and his Growing investment in equipment and planning all indicated that his judgment was becoming compromised by obsession. When someone becomes this focused on a potentially dangerous goal, intervention from trusted individuals is often the only way to prevent tragedy. Legal expert Dr. Carlos Martinez analyzed the liability and regulatory implications of Luis's case, particularly regarding tourist safety and wildlife management responsibilities. This attack revealed significant gaps in Peru's wildlife encounter protocols and emergency response capabilities. While Mr. Vargas bore primary responsibility for his risky decisions, government agencies failed to adequately address known dangerous animal behavior that created predictable public safety risks. Dr. Martinez's analysis led to several regulatory changes in how Peru manages potentially dangerous wildlife encounters. New protocols require immediate intervention when large predators exhibit habituation behaviors, while enhanced communication systems ensure that safety warnings reach all potential victims of dangerous animal activity. Research permit requirements were also strengthened to prevent inadequately prepared individuals from conducting high-risk wildlife studies. The comparative analysis conducted by international wildlife attack researcher Dr. Sarah Thompson placed Luis's case in the context of global human-jaguar encounters. This attack shares characteristics with several documented cases from Brazil and Argentina, where jaguars that lost their natural fear of humans eventually became involved in dangerous encounters. However, Mr. Vargas's survival makes this case unique. Most documented jaguar attacks on humans result in fatalities. Dr. Thompson's research identified patterns that could help predict which jaguars might pose risks to human safety. Animals that show prolonged curiosity about human activity, demonstrate reduced flight responses to human presence, or begin incorporating human territories into their regular patrol routes all represent elevated risk factors. Intervention in such cases could prevent dangerous escalations like the one Luis experienced. Veterinary specialist Dr. Roberto Silva provided insights into Odorongo 8's perspective during the encounter, based on behavioral analysis of the attack sequence and the jaguar's subsequent actions. This was an animal operating outside his normal behavioral parameters, possibly due to stress from territorial disruption or neurological issues that affected his natural responses. The prolonged pursuit of Luis suggests obsessive behavior that is abnormal for healthy jaguars. Dr. Silva's analysis supported the decision to relocate rather than destroy Odorongo 8, noting that the jaguar's behavior might normalize in an environment with minimal human contact. However, he emphasized that such behavioral changes in large predators represent serious warning signs that require immediate management response to protect both animal and human safety. The expert consensus emphasized that Luis's case provided valuable lessons for wildlife research, tourism safety, and predator management throughout the Amazon region. The combination of human overconfidence, animal habituation, and inadequate safety protocols created a perfect storm of conditions that nearly resulted in tragedy. Survival outcome and extensive documentation also provided unprecedented insights into jaguar behavior and human survival capabilities that would benefit future safety planning. Dr. Rojas concluded her analysis with specific recommendations for preventing similar incidents. Wildlife photographers and researchers must maintain appropriate respect for large predators, regardless of their apparent familiarity with human presence. Any wild animal that shows reduced fear of humans should be considered potentially dangerous, and activities in such areas should be suspended until proper safety assessments can be conducted. Mr. Vargas's survival was extraordinary, but we cannot count on such outcomes in future encounters. Luis Vargas's harrowing encounter with Odorongo 8 teaches us the most fundamental lesson about wildlife photography and human-nature interactions. Respect for wild animals must never be compromised by ambition, no matter how experienced or well-prepared we believe ourselves to be. Luis possessed exceptional skills, extensive jungle experience, and genuine love for wildlife, But his fatal mistake was allowing his desire for the perfect photograph to override the basic safety principles that had kept him alive through countless previous expeditions. The prevention lessons from Luis's case are clear and potentially life-saving for anyone who ventures into predator territory. First, any wild animal showing reduced fear of humans represents an immediate danger that should never be approached, regardless of photographic opportunities. Second, solo expeditions in areas with large predators violate basic safety protocols that exist for good reason. Third, expert warnings about specific animal behavior should never be dismissed, even when they conflict with personal goals or professional ambitions. Wildlife safety expert Dr. Ricardo Vargas emphasizes the most critical warning signs that Luis ignored when local guides express spiritual or cultural concerns about specific animals, when multiple experts warn about behavioral abnormalities, and when your own instincts begin to feel doubt. These are nature's way of telling you to step back. Photograph, no matter how spectacular, is worth a human life. Luis's legacy extends far beyond his individual survival story. His case became a catalyst for comprehensive improvements in wildlife photography safety protocols throughout South America. Equipment manufacturers developed new emergency communication devices specifically for solo researchers, while photography organizations established mandatory safety training requirements for expeditions in predator territories. His experience proved that even the most skilled professionals can benefit from enhanced safety measures. The policy changes implemented following Luis's attack have already prevented similar tragedies. Peru's wildlife management agencies now maintain rapid response teams specifically trained for predator encounters, while new communication protocols ensure that dangerous animal behavior reports reach all potential victims within hours rather than days. Tourism operators throughout the Amazon have revised their safety procedures, maintaining greater distances from potentially dangerous wildlife and carrying enhanced emergency equipment. Isabella Martinez, now Luis's wife, has become an advocate for wildlife photography safety education. Luis's attack changed both of us forever, she explains, but it also gave us a mission to help other people avoid similar dangers. Speak at photography workshops and conservation conferences, sharing the warning signs that we missed and the lessons we learned. If our story saves even one life, then Luis's suffering will have served a greater purpose. The community impact of Luis's survival continues to resonate throughout the wildlife photography world. This detailed account of survival techniques has become required reading for photographers working in dangerous environments, while his psychological insights help others recognize when passion begins to compromise judgment. Photography schools now use his case as a textbook example of how professional ambition can blind even experienced individuals to obvious risks. Luis himself has returned to wildlife photography, but with fundamentally changed priorities and methods. Works exclusively as part of research teams, never ventures into predator territory alone, and maintains safety distances that he previously would have considered excessive. The perfect shot isn't worth dying for, he explains to aspiring photographers. There will always be other opportunities, but you only get one life. His photographs from post-recovery expeditions demonstrate that spectacular wildlife images can be captured without compromising safety. Working with telephoto lenses from appropriate distances, Luis has produced some of his most acclaimed work while maintaining protocols that would have prevented his attack with Oterongo 18. His images now carry added impact because viewers understand the respect for nature that informs every shot. The scientific value of Luis's case continues to influence predator research throughout the Amazon. This detailed behavioral observations of Oterongo 18 provided insights into jaguar psychology that would have been impossible to obtain through traditional research methods. Wildlife biologists now use his account to better understand how large predators respond to human presence and what factors can transform curiosity into aggression. Dr. Patricia Rojas, the jaguar specialist who repeatedly warned Luis about the dangers, reflects on the broader implications of his case. Mr. Vargas's survival gives us hope that humans and large predators can coexist, but only when we maintain appropriate respect and caution. His attack resulted from a breakdown in natural boundaries that both species need for safety. By understanding what went wrong, we can prevent similar tragedies while still allowing people to experience and document the incredible wildlife of the Amazon. Oterongo Eighton's successful relocation to Manu National Park demonstrated that problem predators can sometimes be managed without lethal intervention. The jaguar has shown no aggressive behavior toward the research teams that monitor his new territory, suggesting that removing him from the area where he had become habituated to humans allowed his natural behaviors to normalize. This outcome supports conservation approaches that prioritize non-lethal solutions to human-wildlife conflicts. The final expert warning comes from survival specialist Maria Santos, whose analysis of Luis's case has influenced emergency response protocols throughout South America. Mr. Vargas survived because he refused to give up and made intelligent decisions under extreme stress. But survival should never be the goal, prevention should be. The warning signs were present for months before his attack occurred. Future tragedies can be prevented if we learn to recognize and respond to these signs before they escalate into life-threatening situations. For those who work in wildlife environments, Luis's story serves as a constant reminder that nature demands respect, not conquest. The Amazon's predators are not subjects to be photographed at close range, but powerful animals that deserve appropriate caution and distance. Understanding this fundamental truth can mean the difference between capturing incredible images and becoming another statistic in human-wildlife conflict. The audience call to action from Luis's story is clear. Share this knowledge with anyone who ventures into wild places. Whether they are professional photographers, researchers, or adventure tourists, everyone can benefit from understanding the warning signs that Luis missed and the survival techniques that saved his life. Education and awareness are our best tools for preventing future attacks while still allowing people to experience the incredible wildlife that makes places like the Amazon so special. Subscribe to Wild Encounters for more incredible survival stories that demonstrate both the dangers and the beauty of our natural world. These cases provide crucial education for anyone who loves wildlife, showing us how to appreciate nature's power while maintaining the respect and caution that keep both humans and animals safe. Luis's story proves that even the most dangerous encounters can have positive outcomes when we learn from them and use that knowledge to protect others. The final impact statement of Luis Vargas's ordeal is one of transformation and hope. He entered the jungle as a photographer obsessed with capturing the perfect image, regardless of the risks involved. He emerged as a survivor, whose story has educated thousands of people about wildlife safety and the importance of respecting natural boundaries. His scars serve as permanent reminders of how close he came to death, but they also represent his strength, intelligence, and refusal to surrender when faced with nature's ultimate test. Remember Luis's most important lesson: the perfect photograph is never worth your life. Wild animals, especially large predators, demand our respect and appropriate caution. When experts warn about dangerous behavior, when local communities express concerns, and when your own instincts suggest danger, listen to these warnings. They exist to keep you alive so you can continue documenting the incredible wildlife that makes our planet so extraordinary. Luis Vargas went into the Amazon jungle seeking to capture a jaguar's soul through his camera lens. Instead, he discovered the strength of his own soul when tested by the ultimate predator encounter. His survival story reminds us that humans are capable of incredible endurance and intelligence when fighting for their lives, but it also teaches us that the best survival strategy is avoiding dangerous situations through proper preparation, respect for wildlife, and willingness to listen to those who understand the risks better than we do.